Okay, let's dive in. We're all just swimming in this digital ocean these days, aren't we?
Yeah, it's a lot. Information overload is real.
Totally. Especially when you're trying to get your head around really complex ideas, technology, power, our own freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And you, our listener, handed us this pretty substantial source text, multi-part, really grappling with these exact themes.
Right.
So our goal here is to try and cut through some of that noise, pull out the really crucial insights, and, well, make sense of what this source is actually telling us.
Exactly. And this document, it really digs into what it sees as a rising uh, technocratic state.
Technocratic state. Okay.
Yeah, a system where it argues, tech experts and scientists are gaining major influence, kind of quietly pushing world leaders towards, well, more digital control and pretty extensive surveillance.
But it doesn't just paint a bleak picture, right?
Yeah.
It offers a counter vision, too.
It does. It introduces concepts like counter-economics and agorism, presents them as maybe potential ways for individuals to hang on to their liberty and privacy in this changing landscape.
And the source connects this to big recent events. He uses terms like the Great Reset and even COVID-1984. It sees these as highlighting a kind of urgent need for people to figure out how to operate outside these systems it sees as controlling.
Precisely. So our mission really is to understand the threat as the source defines it, looking at its history, how it supposedly shows up today, and then really explore the strategies it proposes. How to navigate this, maybe build something different.
Okay, let's start there. This idea of the technocratic state. How does the source actually define that? Where does it say it came from?
Well, the source traces the term technocracy itself way back to the 1930s.
30s.
Yeah. It pulls a definition from, I think it was a 1938 text, calling it the science of social engineering. The goal being the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism.
So like running society like a machine.
Basically, yeah. Producing and distributing goods and services, but taking messy things like politics and traditional finance out of the equation. The original idea was ruled by scientists, engineers, not politicians or business owners.
And did it catch on?
It had a moment, apparently, after the Great Depression, some popularity, but then, yeah, it largely faded from mainstream discussion.
But the source argues it didn't actually die out.
Not at all. It claims these ideas have been quietly influencing modern leaders for decades and are sort of bubbling up in a new form today. It talks about a modern technocrat class.
Okay, who are they, according to the source?
People largely within, the big tech industries, individuals who, the SACE argues, wield enormous power, not necessarily through official government roles, but through their companies, their massive wealth, their cultural sway. The source suggests they have the means to potentially influence elections, push global initiatives like geoengineering, maybe even shape financial markets.
And a big part of this is linked to technology itself, the surveillance aspect.
Absolutely. A core concern raised in the source, tied directly to just how fast tech is advancing, is what it sees as this almost unavoidable trend towards more and more surveillance, which it argues naturally means less privacy and less personal liberty.
Right. And this is where those terms we've heard a lot recently come in, like the Great Reset. How does the source frame that?
It views the Great Reset, the one announced by the World Economic Forum, not just as, some talking shop idea. It sees it as a predetermined path, a key piece in building this planned technocratic state it's describing.
And it connects this to other things, too.
Yeah, it links this perspective back to earlier events. It specifically mentions Event 201.
Event 201, that was the pandemic simulation, late 2019.
That's the one. Focused on a hypothetical coronavirus pandemic response. The source really highlights that the simulation included discussions around things like mass lockdowns, quarantines, censoring viewpoints that disagreed with the official line.
Yeah.
And even as presented in the simulation scenarios, the idea of using law enforcement to, enforce compliance or potentially arrest people who question the narrative.
And it goes even further, linking this to UN goals, Agenda 2030.
It does. It interprets things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, not just as, say, environmental or social plans. It sees them as part of a deeper agenda to monitor, control, and direct all life on the planet.
That's a strong claim.
It is. The source argues that while they're framed publicly around health or well-being or climate action, the real goal, from its perspective, is setting up a worldwide technocratic state, run by experts, in the name of solving global crises.
Is there anything specific it points to as evidence for that interpretation?
It brings up that Forbes article that got a lot of attention. The Welcome to 2030, I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better. A one. The source sees that piece as like a stark illustration of the potential future being envisioned.
Okay, which brings us to that other term you mentioned the source uses, COVID-1984.
Right. It's a mashup, obviously, of COVID-19 and Orwell's 1984.
Yeah, pretty evocative.
The source uses it to describe the period, roughly 2020 to 2022. It argues governments use the pandemic as a justification for what it considers authoritarian practices. Things like, the widespread lockdowns, mandatory health measures, really tight restrictions on movement, even on speech.
So the source views these not just as public health measures, but as something more.
It sees them as revealing, quote, authoritarian colors,
Ah.
suggesting they went way beyond what was necessary for public health. It claims lockdowns, specifically, were also a tool to shut down protests, silence critics, and maybe even more strategically, to speed up the shift towards this technocratic digital dystopia it talks about, by creating this sudden need, this opportunity to sell and roll out surveillance tech.
And it mentions this tactic potentially being used again.
Yeah, it notes the emergence of terms like climate lockdown, suggesting this playbook, this use of crisis for control, could be applied to other perceived threats down the line.
Okay, so that paints the picture of the threat as the source sees it. An old idea, technocracy, kind of re-emerging, using modern tech for control, leveraging crises. Quite a vision.
It's definitely a stark warning laid out in the text.
Given that perspective, then, how does the source suggest people should respond? Where do counter-economics and agorism fit in?
Right, this is where the source pivots towards solutions. It defines counter-economics drawing a lot from Samuel Edward Konkin III and his followers as the practice and also the study of counter-economic acts.
Counter-economic acts like what?
Well, there's a simpler quote it uses from that world: doing what you want when you want for your own good reasons. The source frames it as a conscious rejection of establishment economics, finding ways around what it calls roadblocks to your own liberty, your health.
And agorism. Is that different?
Agorism is the philosophy Konkin developed around this. It essentially links anarchy, and it means anarchy in the sense of voluntary association, not chaos with the black market, using it as uncontrolled markets. The source notes Konkin was actually into science fiction, and interestingly, predicted way back that new computer technology could help counter-economic activity, make it easier.
But with a catch.
A big catch. The source makes clear Konkin also saw the huge danger of authorities using that same tech for state control, a double-edged sword.
So what's the overall goal of counter-economics according to the source?
Ultimately, the source sees it as a potential practical answer to this digital dystopia it feels. It provides, in the source's words, a philosophical foundation to the simple act of saying no to immoral or unjust state rules and doing what you must to thrive.
Saying no.
Yeah. The basic idea is about people, individually and together, choosing to opt out of systems they feel just don't align with their values or threaten their freedom. Mass opting out, ideally.
Okay, so how do you actually do that? What are the practical strategies the source lays out for this opting out?
Well, a really big emphasis in the source material is on community, building parallel networks.
Okay.
It really highlights something called freedom cells as a practical model.
Freedom cells.
Yeah, described as small local groups, like maybe 7 to 9 people, focused on mutual aid, setting real, tangible goals together.
What kind of goals?
Things like achieving some level of food security, maybe setting up reliable communication plans that don't rely on the usual networks, having bug-out plans for emergencies, maybe learning self-defense skills together.
Practical stuff.
Very practical. The source stresses these groups should focus on continuous learning, and this is key. Encourage members to start new cells once their own is running smoothly. So you get this decentralized, spreading network effect.
That makes sense. Building capacity that way.
Exactly. The source sees it as a powerful way to show that these decentralized voluntary networks can actually work. It also mentions an event called the Greater Reset Activation.
The Greater Reset.
Yeah.
Like a counter to the WF's Great Reset.
Precisely. Described as a direct challenge focused specifically on decentralization and getting people activated to, as they put it, exit and build.
Exit and build. Okay, so beyond groups, what about individual actions?
The source breaks these down into 2 types, which it says work together: vertical and horizontal agorism.
Vertical and horizontal.
Yeah. Vertical actions are about shrinking your dependence on the main systems, aligning your actions with your principles, like growing some of your own food, even if it's just a little, using encrypted messaging apps that actually respect your privacy, setting up community skill shares, maybe alternative support projects so you're less reliant on state welfare, stuff like that.
Okay, so reducing dependence. What's horizontal agorism then?
Horizontal is more about engaging in activities the state might see as illegal or immoral.
Ah, examples.
The source explicitly mentions things like using alternative currencies, crypto, barter, cash to bypass central banks, practicing tax resistance, running small businesses without all the official licenses, participating in gray or black market.
Right, so combining those two.
Exactly. Agorism, in the source's view, is the strategy of using both vertical and horizontal actions together to consciously move away from relying on the state, away from dependency, towards more self-reliance and, well, agorism.
One really concrete area must be money, the financial system. Does the source talk about opting out of banks?
It does, yeah. It talks about becoming unbanked, though it's very careful to say this is not financial advice.
Good disclaimer.
Definitely. But it offers suggestions based on its principles. It also acknowledges the real downsides. Security fears are legitimate, you have fewer options for big purchases or loans, and it can be really hard to prove your income if you need to rent a place or get utilities.
Yeah, I can see that being a major hurdle.
Totally. The source shares anecdotes about that friction. Like, imagine trying to rent an apartment without traditional pay stubs or bank statements. It's tough. Or finding out you absolutely need a regular bank account for common apps, like ride sharing or food delivery, even if you have money elsewhere.
So what solutions does it suggest?
Looking into local credit unions, maybe private banks as alternatives, taking personal responsibility for storing your wealth safely, which is a big deal, and actively using alternatives like physical cash, silver, crypto, or just direct barter. The source even suggests, setting yourself a deadline to start making that shift.
Okay. Then there's the other huge one, big tech. Surveillance. What's the strategy there?
Yeah, the source paints a picture of a pretty pervasive surveillance net. Smart devices everywhere, biometric data collection like facial recognition, even DNA databases. It mentions the US and China specifically in its references.
It feels like it's coming from all angles.
Well, the source makes an interesting distinction. It argues corporations gather tons of data through our voluntary use of their stuff phones, apps, websites. But governments, it claims, often use their authority to force compliance with surveillance tech.
So two different pressures. What can you do?
Strategies presented include, well, the simple one. Just reduce the number of digital devices you use every day. Be more conscious.
Makes sense.
Also, actively using encryption. VPNs for your internet traffic, public key cryptography like PGP for secure comms. But, and this is a big but from the source, citing leaked info, you should always assume your digital communications could be seen by state actors. Always. Plan for that.
Assume you're being watched online, basically.
Pretty much. It also suggests actively seeking out alternative phones, devices, apps, operating systems that are built with privacy and open source principles in mind. It mentions things like the F-Droid App Store for Android alternatives, resources like takebackwar.org for finding Linux-based OS options, basically trying to move away from the dominant tech platforms.
Okay, so digital detox, encryption, finding alternatives. What about physically opting out, like changing where or how you live?
The source explores that too. It lays out a few different paths. One is called hold down the fort.
Let down the fort.
Yeah, basically staying where you are and working for change locally. Activism, community education, building those local networks we talked about. The source does note this is generally harder in or near big cities.
Okay, what else?
It briefly mentions a historical philosophy called Vonu from the 60s.
Vonu, never heard of it.
It was about achieving invulnerability to coercion by totally cutting ties with the state. Operating only in cash, no legal residence, living nomadically or in makeshift structures. There was apparently a newsletter, Vonu Life. The source acknowledges this is incredibly difficult, requires huge sacrifice.
Sounds extreme.
It is. A more common strategy it discusses is exit and build.
Exit and build. That sounds familiar.
Yeah, this involves actually relocating, moving to more rural areas or places the source sees as more politically liberated. And the goal is to actively build intentional communities based on these opt-out principles, specifically trying to avoid invasive tech and state control.
So kind of creating pockets of freedom.
That's the idea. The source sees this as complementary to hold down the fort. It provides places for people to literally exit what it calls the technocratic matrix.
And there was one more concept. Something about an underground railroad.
Right, the counter-economic underground railroad. Fascinating idea. It's envisioned not as a literal railroad, obviously, but as a decentralized network. free communities acting as safe havens, support systems for people the source calls refugees of the technocratic state.
Wow, refugees. It draws a parallel to the Civil War.
It does, explicitly referencing the historical Underground Railroad, but it stresses this concept is about voluntary movement and mutual aid, absolutely not human trafficking, helping people who choose to leave.
How would that even work?
The source actually mentions a potential vetting process discussed in the materials. Things like signups, maybe surveys, group calls, using changing meeting spots for security, even walkie-talkies for comms during travel.
Any real-world examples?
The source points to reports during the COVID restriction era of Canadians and others traveling to Mexico seeking refuge from measures they disagreed with. It sees that as illustrating this kind of movement, seeking freedom from perceived state overreach.
Okay, that's a really broad spectrum of strategies the source presents, from local groups all the way to relocating or living totally off-grid.
It definitely covers a lot of ground. And importantly, the source is very clear this path is not easy. It talks quite a bit about the challenges and the drawbacks.
Yeah, I was thinking completely opting out seems almost impossible in today's world.
It is, according to the source. It emphasizes it's a constant struggle, requires real adaptability, because you will have to interact with the mainstream systems sometimes, or with people still fully in them. People filing taxes, using credit cards, operating within those structures.
You're going to just build a wall around yourself.
Not realistically, no. And the source also gets into the psychological side, how populations can be influenced, even, as it puts it, propagandized to work against their own interests.
How so?
It brings up Matthias Desmet's theory of mass formation.
Mass formation.
Yeah, as a potential explanation, according to the source, for why people might show this intense, sometimes aggressive obedience to certain measures, particularly during what it calls COVID-19 84, even if those measures seem to lack clear scientific backing or feel disproportionate.
So like a kind of collective hypnosis?
Sort of. The source suggests mass formation can create the psychological state where people become highly susceptible to a dominant narrative and really intolerant of any dissent.
Interesting. Any other theories mentioned?
It also cites something called the parasite stress theory, referencing a study called Pathogens and Politics. The idea there, as the source presents it, is that just the perception of being vulnerable to infection or other big threats, even if the threat isn't quite as bad as perceived, can psychologically make people prefer conformity, make them more willing to accept authoritarian measures and leaders.
So fear itself can make people more obedient.
That's the argument. And this ties into the source's big concern, that powerful entities, the technocrat class it describes, can actually weaponize basic human emotions, like compassion wanting to protect others in a health crisis, or fear of getting sick, fear of being ostracized, using crises like pandemics or climate change to push compliance and centralize control.
That's a pretty chilling thought that compassion could be used that way.
It is. And the source touches on one more tough reality of resisting state power. Informers. Yeah. It just notes that historically societies under heavy state control are often riddled with informers. People reporting on their neighbors, sometimes for reward, sometimes out of belief, sometimes just fear. The source mentions the general distrust and fear associated with them, even among peaceful counter-economists. It's just another factor you might encounter.
Okay, so it's definitely not presented as an easy path. Friction, psychological pressures, even informers. But to argue that counter-economics can work, the source must provide examples, right?
Oh, absolutely. It offers a ton of historical and more current examples to back up its claims about the viability and power of counter-economics.
Like what?
Well, it spends quite a bit of time on the American underground economy, especially looking at reports from the late 70s, early 80s.
Okay.
It uses stats and stories from places like U.S. News and World Report, the L.A. Times, columnists like Jack Anderson, Sylvia Porter, painting this picture of just how big untaxed income and tax evasion were back then.
How big are we talking?
The numbers cited by the source are pretty eye-opening. Estimates of 15 to 20 million Americans involved, maybe 4.5 million fully supported by this underground income.
Wow. How do they do it?
All sorts of ways described in the source. Strict cash dealing, simple barter, gives an example of a lawyer in Flint, Michigan trading legal work for an antique credenza. Businesses manipulating their books, skimming cash off the top.
And why? Just greed.
The source argues it was often fueled or justified by a kind of anti-state resentment, a feeling that the system was unfair. And it stresses this created a big ripple effect. Friends, family, customers often knew about it, sometimes participated too.
So it wasn't just isolated individuals.
Not according to the source. And it briefly mentions similar large black and gray markets existing in places like Italy, Germany, Great Britain, based on its references, showing it wasn't just an American thing.
But I remember you saying the Soviet Union section was significant in the source.
Hugely significant. It presents the USSR as this prime example of a full-blown counter-economy that thrived right alongside, even inside, the official state system. The source really emphasizes the helplessness of the Soviet state to stop it and the potency of the individuals who kept it going.
Helplessness. The Soviet state seemed pretty powerful.
Powerful, yes, but the source shares these amazing anecdotes. Stories of Russian millionaires running huge private businesses entirely outside state control, like Abram Eisenberg making hosiery, the Glazenberg brothers with synthetic fiber factories. Operations so big the anti-corruption police knew about them, but they were too widespread, maybe too useful to totally shut down.
Too useful. How?
Well, the source uses this great example of a meat store manager in Moscow under communism. Even if the manager was a loyal party member, the state supply system was so unreliable they had to engage in black market deals, what the source calls the unofficial rules of Soviet trade, just to get meat for their store and meet their quotas. Market reality trumped ideology.
So the black market actually propped up the official system in a way.
In many ways, yes, according to the source. It argues this activity didn't just annoy the state, it actively corroded its legitimacy. Citizens relied on the counter-economy. Even state factories often had to fish for parts on the black market to keep running. It cites reporter Hedrick Smith describing this vast Nalevo on-the-side economy that was essential for everyone, institutions and individuals alike. It was just deeply embedded.
Those Soviet examples really make the point about resilience under pressure.
They really do. And to hammer home what it sees as the unstoppable nature of the counter-economy, the source even dedicates a whole chapter to drug counter-economics.
Why drugs specifically?
Because, the source explains, the illegal drug market is something almost everyone understands exists, operates globally, and persists despite massive, expensive prohibition efforts by states worldwide. It's a clear example of a black market states can't eliminate.
Okay. What points does it make there?
It talks about the sheer scale, claims the marijuana sector alone touches nearly every man, woman, and child in some way. It contrasts the intense focus on banning certain drugs while other dangerous substances, like arsenic or cyanide, are less controlled. The source suggests prohibition itself creates the conditions for these powerful black markets and fosters distinct countercultures.
Does it blame organized crime, like the mafia?
Interestingly, no. It argues the market functions less like a top-down mafia structure and more through, as it puts it, Adam Smith's invisible hand. Just individuals at every level, growers, smugglers, dealers, users, seeing opportunities for profit or need and acting on them.
Any specific examples?
Yeah, it uses references talking about Colombia's pot empire, where huge busts still only seized a tiny fraction, maybe less than 10% of production. Lebanon's hashish trade money is supposedly filling its banks, heroin labs and smuggling networks in Pakistan with global reach.
And the economic impact?
Significant. The source mentions things like land values skyrocketing in U.S. growing areas. And again, that ripple effect involving ordinary people. Mechanics fixing smuggling vehicles, dock workers handling shipments, families and friends being aware or involved. It even notes resistance, like California growers fighting back against aerial spraying programs mentioned in the source.
So these examples, U.S. underground, Soviet system, drug trade, are all used by the source to build this case that counter-economics is powerful, resilient, maybe unstoppable.
That's exactly the argument it's building, that when demand and opportunity exist, state attempts to fully suppress this kind of activity are incredibly difficult, perhaps even impossible.
Okay, it definitely uses those examples effectively.
Yeah.
Given all that, what's the source's ultimate vision? If counter-economics is the tool, what's the goal for the future?
Well, the source keeps coming back to its view that what it calls economic enslavement is key to the problem. Specifically, the reliance on debt-based systems using state-backed fiat money.
Fiat money, money not backed by gold or silver, just government decree.
Exactly. The source sees fiat money as inherently open to corruption and fraud. It calls inflation basically a form of theft by the state.
And that connects to the counter-economy.
Directly. The source argues that inflation, especially hyperinflation, actually stimulates the counter-economy. When the official money loses value fast, people naturally look for other ways to trade and store value. Barter, commodities, alternative currencies.
So it sees a way out of traditional banking.
It suggests things like alternative private banks, ones that might accept physical assets like gold, offer real privacy, support free market principles. It mentions an example like A&Co from its references as a model for opting out of the mainstream banking system.
Okay, and beyond money, what's the bigger picture it paints?
The source makes a really explicit call to reject things like Agenda 2030 and the Great Reset, seeing them as top-down control plans. Instead, it proposes building what it calls the People's Reset.
A people's reset, what does that look like?
It offers this alternative vision for 2030, using phrasing like, "Welcome to 2030. I own land, live among like-minded people." The vision centers on intentional communities, emphasizes individual property ownership, and focuses on building decentralized trade networks, both local and international, operating outside state control.
How do we get there, according to the source?
Yeah.
Any specific goals?
Yeah, it proposes creating what it calls agorist, or Autonomous Development Goals, ADGs.
ADGs instead of SDGs.
Kind of. The idea is to take some of the positive-sounding concepts you might find in the UN SDGs, but frame them as purely voluntary bottom-up goals, things individuals, businesses, communities can choose to adopt. A total contrast to what it sees as a top-down imposed agenda.
Can you give some examples of these ADGs from the source?
Sure. The list includes things like promoting permaculture and indigenous food systems, creating local pesticide-free, GMO-free zones, actively teaching digital privacy and encryption skills, deliberately defunding corporations, banks, governments you disagree with through boycotts and divestment, actively supporting alternative currencies, protecting access to land and resources like rainwater, promoting alternative health practices outside the mainstream system.
Wow, that's a really comprehensive list. It's like a blueprint for building parallel structures.
It really is, based on voluntary action, not mandates. And the source kind of ties all this together with what it calls the freedom formula.
The freedom formula sounds intriguing.
Yeah, it's presented as an equation. Level of freedom desired plus willingness to change your actual experience of freedom.
Okay, unpack that a little.
The source uses it to make the point that achieving more freedom isn't just about changing external circumstances. It's deeply personal. It requires identifying what level of freedom you really want, then honestly looking at what you're truly willing to do to get there in terms of your time, your energy, the risks you'll take.
And then acting on it.
And then acting. The source makes the argument, its perspective, that too many people have essentially traded away invaluable privacy and liberty for convenience and pleasure.
That's a powerful frame. So let's try and pull this whole deep dive together. We've journeyed through this source material. It laid out a case for this growing technocratic state, using tech for surveillance and control.
Right, pointing to things like the Great Reset and using terms like COVID-1984 as evidence of this trend it perceives.
And then we looked at the source's proposed answer. Counter-economics and agorism, a philosophy and a practical toolkit, really, for opting out, building parallel systems.
Using those vertical strategies, becoming more self-reliant, and horizontal ones operating outside state rules.
We covered the specific suggestions for getting away from traditional finance, from big tech surveillance, even physical options like exit and build, or that counter-economic underground railroad concept.
And we definitely talked about the challenges the source highlights, how difficult it is, the need to adapt, dealing with the mainstream, potential propaganda, even informers.
Right. But crucial to its argument were those historical examples that the U.S. underground, the massive Soviet countereconomy, the global drug trade, all used to argue that these alternative economies are incredibly resilient, maybe even unstoppable, as the source puts it.
Yeah, arguing they persist despite state efforts. And finally, we touched on the source's vision for an alternative future, rejecting top-down agendas, building the people's reset through voluntary goals, decentralized networks.
All leading back to that freedom formula.
Exactly, centered on individual autonomy and that trade-off between freedom and convenience.
It's certainly a dense, challenging perspective presented in this source material. That formula and the argument about trading liberty for convenience really sticks with you.
It definitely makes you think about your own choices within this bigger picture it paints.
It really does. You know, the source seems to suggest that maybe the biggest fight for freedom isn't just against these external systems, these perceived technocratic controls, but maybe it's more internal.
How do you mean?
Well, testing our own willingness, like the formula says, our willingness to actually prioritize liberty when convenience is so easy. And also, our ability to see through manipulation, especially when, as the source argues, fear and even our own compassion can be weaponized by those seeking control.
That definitely reframes where the real struggle might lie, not just out there, but in here.
Absolutely. So, after digging into all of this from the source, What stands out most to you, the listener, when you think about your own balance, that balance between convenience and freedom?